the pricing that they seem to be able to achieve as compared to traditional lessors, it's so different. You kind of wonder what it is that they are or aren't factoring in.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I am Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavant of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who are we talking to today?
Today we are going to speak with Donna Ager. Donna is currently an attorney that works in aviation. She's got quite an extensive background. She is currently she's a partner at Walker's, and prior to that, she was a partner at Maples Group. She was also a partner at Simmons & Simmons, or Simon, I think it's Simmons & Simmons. She was also an associate at Clifford Chance. She worked in the finance group as legal counsel for Airbus, and she worked at Freshfields. She's got a postgraduate degree in legal studies in law, and she also has a Bachelor of Law from Sheffield Hallam University. She was awarded the Women in Business Law Award for being the European Aviation Lawyer, and she's also a member of the Aviation Club. So we're gonna talk kind of legalese stuff today, get her thoughts, and it's gonna be really fun to kind of chat with her. She's got a great background, so it's gonna be a lot of fun. So Donna, this is your time on wing.
Just a quick intermission before we continue with the show. We do get a lot of questions about how our listeners can support the show, and frankly, the easiest way is to continue the spirit of the show, which is just to reach out to us at conferences. But we also run businesses as well, and you can support us by supporting a lot of the work that we do. You can support the work that I do through Visual Approach by visiting visualapproach.io, where we produce a lot of research and analysis, a lot of data visualizations.
From my side, obviously, I focus more on the metals, so anything that's aircraft related, if you're looking for valuations, whether it's on aircraft engines, I'm happy to help with any of those types of projects. So we appreciate certainly the opportunities to work with all of you. And we certainly also appreciate just the fact that people are willing to listen to what we have to say and enjoy kind of our thoughts and takes on what we think is a fascinating industry. So thank you.
Okay, back to the show.
So look, Donna, thank you very much for being on the podcast. It's great to have you on. We've obviously, heard about you and heard, kind of seen you around the conference circuit. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. As we do with every one of our guests, we'd love to hear kind of how you got your start in aviation and kind of go through how you got to where you are today. So I'll kind of leave it to you to share that with us, and then we'll go from there.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. I mean, having looked down at your previous sort of interviewees, I'm quite flattered that you bothered to invite a lawyer on. So, hopefully that'll give some interest to some people. So that is my background, essentially. I trained as a lawyer. I started out in the City of London in a firm called Freshfields, who back in the day, and I'm probably showing my age, were really big in aviation, don't really have an aviation division anymore. So it was kind of, I suppose, a stroke of luck, but it was really by chance I ended up in the aviation industry. As a lawyer, you don't really go in and train and study planning to do asset finance because it was, little or not heard of, particularly in law school. But it was a seat where there was a lot of trainee requirement because, as we know, there's hundreds and hundreds of documents whenever you're doing a financing. So they were very keen to get as many trainees into the department as possible. So I did my time there. And then actually the real game changer for me was when they sent me on secondment to Airbus in South France. So, which was a very sought after sort of trainee seat. So in the UK, you do 4 seats. And if you're lucky, you get to sort of get one of the prime picking ones, which I was. And I got sent to the South of France to spend 6 months hanging out in Toulouse and working now and again, a lot less than I did in the City of London, that's for sure. And I suppose, it sounds cheesy, but that was kind of when I fell in love with aviation, right? I met a lot of the commercial guys down there. You were on the production line. They walked me around stuff. I got to see, parts of the aircraft that little or didn't know about at all, and learned the difference between sort of how I could tell an A319 and an A320 when it was up in the sky, and bored people with that. But yeah, I mean that was really the start of it for me. And then when I came back to London, pretty quickly thereafter, Airbus approached me about working for them directly. And I'd enjoyed my time so much there that I just thought, yeah, why not? It was a great time. It was a brilliant time, actually, to be at Airbus. It was just at that point where Airbus became a genuine competitor for Boeing, right? So we were in the process of doing loads of project finance initiatives around the A380 program. So I, as well as doing aircraft financing, I was doing ship financing. I was reclaiming land in Scotland and China, and barge financing and widening roads in the south of France for parts to come along. It was just really, really interesting stuff. And then aside of that, I was sort of doing the more day-to-day stuff. So I got to work on the EasyJet, purchase agreement, which was massive for Airbus back in the day. I mean, ordering 150 aircraft these days, it's the job of a staff.
It's a Tuesday.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, I know.
It's like any old Tom, Dick, and Harry. But like back then, Ryanair had I think they'd signed up for 120 or something with Boeing plus option. So it was like a must-win campaign. So it was a great one to be on. Really exciting. Yeah,
and they were 737 operators at the time, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah. This was huge. We had to turn them from Boeing to Airbus, and the levels of discussions and stuff. I remember this is the less glamorous side of aviation. EasyJet's headquarters are in a place called Luton, just north of London. I don't know if you've ever been lucky enough or perhaps unlucky enough to go there. It's called Easyland, right? And at the time when I went, it was 2 porter cabins in a breeze block over a sort of puddle of water to get into it. And I spent 2 months on and off there, living in the equivalent of like a sort of old age pensioners home, because there was no nice hotels locally. So not the most glamorous of trips, but one that really I think was quite formative in my career in terms of what I learned from it and stuff.
I love this. Okay, so this happens in aviation so often, right? We find the glamour and there's travel, right? It's what we do. This is global travel, and here you're with Airbus, right? The global organization, and they say, great, we've got something for you to do. You're going to travel. You're like, great, where is it? And they're like, Luton.
Exactly. And the worst thing was they told me that I was going for 2 days, so I took hardly anything with me. And had to keep going to this like funny old like dry cleaners just down the road because the hotel didn't have any facilities. It was just hilarious. But when I was at Airbus, I did some really interesting trips as well. I went to I've sort of may have mentioned it before to you guys, but I went to the Yemen. Right, I did a deal with Yemenia. And that was just fascinating. I mean, the cultural difference and stuff like that. But my friends always thought it was a joke because back in the day, you might remember on Friends, the program. There's a woman called Janice. Do you remember?
Yes.
Right? And Janice went to the Yemen. And so my mate used to say to me, other than Janice, you're the only person I know that's gone to the Yemen. Right? but
it's pretty funny.
It was, a real experience. I was the only woman in the room. No one would look at me. And but it was such a learning experience, and adapting your behaviours and stuff. And when we work in an international, like global sort of setting like we do, you do need to be culturally aware and sensitive to other people, and especially when you're on their territory. And I was, at the time I was only sort of mid-20s, so it was kind of like, pretty quickly I had to sort of adapt to this. But it's something you get used to in aviation, and not every trip is glamorous, but you do get to go to some really interesting places, right? So, and that's again one of them that I remember. And then slightly more dodgy. I was in Kenya once, and I remember a man turned up with the deposit for the sale agreement in cash and suitcases. Yeah. So that was one. That was an interesting one. The ethical side of being a lawyer. I quickly panicked and rang my boss. That was my response to that one. And he said, "Get the money." I was like, No.
Yeah.
Like,
just bring it with you. That's right. There won't be any problems. Just bring it with you. Bring a big suitcase of cash, which I'm sure those deposits are not small.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. So, no, I mean, and then after that, I was back in London again. So I loved my time in Airbus. It was the point at which I really, really enjoyed being, I felt really part of the industry and close to it. But I also felt from a development on a legal career basis, I wasn't getting that kind of training that I really wanted. So I moved back to London and joined Clifford Chance, who are, highly renowned as a law firm in the space, so we were getting to do really sort of interesting and cutting edge deals, but more on the sort of lender investor side of things, rather than looking at it from a manufacturer focus. And that's kind of where my career path has sort of followed that side of the table ever since. I was at Clifford Chance for the best part of 10 years, and then moved in the short term to another firm called Simmons, where I joined a couple of partners, but that was before I was approached by Maples, which is an offshore firm. So a bit left field, I thought, initially when they approached me, but they wanted me to sort of basically be their dedicated asset finance partner, developing an Irish practice. So it was a real great opportunity, and we all know the importance of the Irish aviation industry, right? So great opportunity, and to sort of use the client base that I had from my UK law firm experience and sort of try and breed that across to the Irish side in Maples. And I was there until 2 years ago when I joined Walker's, which is a similarly structured firm, but obviously a whole lot better, right? So so it's great. I work, we do a lot of structured product type stuff, which is really where I find it really interesting. We're based in investment hubs, so it's all about ensuring you've got like efficient tax treatment, structuring and stuff, which is the bit I really enjoy. I've kind of done my days in the trenches, 15-hour days, churning documents and stuff like that, and that's all good. But what I like is really sort of structuring deals and advising on what works, and particularly sort of look at the capital markets deals and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where I am now. I was actually just on a call with some guys and we were talking about sort of setting up a fund-based platform, and done an awful lot of that lately. I mean, private equity interest in the space just seems to grow and grow, right? Setting up funds and into Irish leasing platforms and all of that good stuff is kind of mostly what I do these days, as well as sort of bank financing.
Yeah, but how often do you get to Luton?
Oh, mate, I make an effort to do an annual pilgrimage.
That's great.
No, I mean, Luton isn't actually that far, but I've managed to avoid it for the last 30 years of my life.
Yeah. Well, you did your stint there, right? Did they have a plaque because you were there for so long? Kind of like, thanks for coming.
I saw that hotel, absolutely loved it, because like literally Airbus booked it out for months, and I think it's the best year of their revenue ever. Do you know what I mean? I imagine they wondered what the bank thought, what the hell is going on here? This is actually making some money rather than empty all the time. But so I'm sure they miss us, but probably not anybody else, to be honest.
Yeah,
I love
not anybody else.
I love the progression, right? So heavy on the documents with the Airbus side, right? Creating the documents, and I certainly am not a lawyer, but I've sold aircraft and I've worked with the contracts team, and I've been with them as my eyes glazed over and they do their thing. So I've kind of seen just the specialization and very document heavy process. But then it's really interesting that you're kind of shift into the structured, I don't know if structured finance is the right term, but the finance that is structured and the structures and building that. What, not to jump to the conclusions here, but I'm really kind of interested in how that you've seen that sector change. You talked a lot about the private equity firms coming in, building the new funds and the structures around that. Are there kind of some overarching structures and changes that you've really kind of seen over the years?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the advent and the involvement of private equity has really changed the leasing structures. I mean, back in the day, sort of 15 years ago, when you were talked about operating lessors, they were like substantive companies, offices, lots of employees, doing all of their, having all of the in-house capabilities. Whereas these days, 9 out of 10 entities that set up to lease aircraft are sort of what we would describe as sort of fund-backed or investment-backed platforms with a servicer arrangement. And that's hugely different. I mean, although from the outside looking in, it functions in the same way, and the way it's structured in the investment strategies and the means by which sort of everyone gets their remuneration it's quite different. And even the traditional lessors, the large guys like AerCap, Avalon, SMBC, that's a part of their business as well.
Sure.
I mean, it's not like they're one or the other. They realise the benefit of this kind of less personal exposure with just a sort of fee income, and that's a real change. I mean, in the European market, we are still seeing a lot of bank debt. That's still the way it is, and the US market is still predominantly, particularly for the airlines, the debt capital markets and public markets, right? But the private equity sector seems to just have an insatiable desire for aviation, and when they decide they're going in, it's not a few quid, it's like billions of dollars. They kind of off the bat, $2 billion into a platform, and allow a third party to basically run that for them, which, they've obviously done huge risk analysis on it. I have some skepticism about the kind of the modelling and stuff. I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm not.
You're paid to be skeptical. Like that's literally your job.
That's right.
Yeah.
Maybe that's right. It's just that, when you look at some of these guys that have come in, the pricing that they seem to be able to achieve as compared to traditional lessors, when you're looking at sale and leasebacks and stuff like that, it's so different to the guys that are modelled so traditionally. You kind of wonder what it is that they are or aren't factoring in. I know they do short-term flips. I get that, mm-hmm. right? They're not long-term play, and I get that kind of. And they don't have the capital adequacy requirements that financial institutions or regulated financial institutions do. I understand that as well, but I do have some concerns that sometimes default risk and downtime stuff's not fully understood. But hey, that's not my job, right? My job is to make sure legal risk is covered. But, I obviously get a lot of documentation across my desk, so I get quite a good, insight is into how different things are priced and stuff. And there's definitely a marked difference there.
Yeah,
we haven't really talked a lot about this other than kind of privately with clients, Garrick, but I'm fascinated by this. First of all, I did not anticipate the conversation going in this direction, but you know what you're talking about, so let's do it.
Do it.
We have talked a lot about the aircraft shortage since COVID, right? We're just talking about what has impacted the market, how that's impacted aircraft values, how lease rates, right? That's what Garrick does. He makes up numbers for a living.
Yep, a lot, all the time.
But we focus on the supply side. What we haven't spent a whole lot of time doing that you're really kind of touching on here is at the same time, we had a reduction in supply, both just in numbers, but let's just talk value, like overall total value of aircraft that are delivering. At the same time, that number went down just because fewer airplanes were leaving the factories. The amount of capital that was looking for homes went through the roof from 21, 22, right? I mean, we now call that inflation, but whatever. That's a different. That's a different story for a different day. The inevitable result of that supply demand imbalance, the supply of capital with lower available aircraft with which to place it, could only result in lower pricing. Exactly what you're describing here. And it just seems very macro, almost, hindsight is 2020 to look at it from that perspective, but it's really starting to kind of add up. And as we go forward, it kind of forces me to consider that balance in a different perspective.
But the other thing to factor in is that most of these funds have an aggressive ROI on their investments, right? Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And they're meeting them. So, Gary, this is your expertise, not mine. But that's where, for me, I find it hard to sort of marry the two. Lower pricing, but this higher requirement on return.
Yeah, which, I mean, look, I think there's a few things that factor into that. One, the flip that you mentioned, I think that's the biggest thing, right? Because as long as you've got somebody that's willing to pay more at a future point in time, right, then you can you can work the returns so that they work for you, right? You'd be like, hey, look, yeah, we bought it for 10, we're selling it for 13. Great, we got it, we met our goals. Now let's go do it again, right? And as long as that keeps happening, great. Now it's when that changes, then obviously that's when you have issues. But I think the other part too that I think allows people to kind of justify potentially high returns is something which is affecting the industry when you talk about like maintenance, right? Which is such a big piece of the value of each deal. Yeah. And when you've got OEM pricing escalation that is double digit year over year for the last couple of years, you've had inflation, which is really high. So there's a lot of things that you can use on the back end to say, look, with the environment that we're in, nobody thinks that we're going to get out of this environment for the next, 5 years, 7 years, whatever it is. So then you can kind of justify that like end of, hey, we're supposed to get this big payment at the end based on the numbers that go up every year by at least, 3, 4, 5%, right? If not more. So then, you can play around with that. Cause when it's one of the things that we talked about with like Phil during the last podcast about like the makeup of an operating lease, it hasn't changed, right? It's all the same. Yeah. It all comes down to, what's your cost of funds? And, at the end of the day, where do you put your residual expectations, right? And those are the things you can kind of play with. Everything else, it's like, well, you're taking a bigger risk because of the credit or the asset type, and that's why you're pricing it in. But if it's a competitive, environment, then you can't really price that in. You have to be like, well, do we want the deal or not? So so I think it's interesting how that plays out, but that it seems to change as we get into, I think maybe the current environment that we're going into, where you start seeing demand kind of start falling off, and there's some things that are changing. And it's like, okay, well, people start getting a little bit more nervous. Maybe they hold on some deals or not, or right? Because like you think about the ABS market in January, right, in Dublin, everybody was like, oh my God, it's going to be great this year. There's going to be tons. Mm-hmm. And we saw a few that went out, and now there's still some that are in the works, but it's definitely slowed down because I think investors went, hold on, it's like market's not that great. The tariff stuff, you've got demand that's starting to come down from the US. What does that mean? Is that going to spread? So let's make sure we don't just jump in and then overpay.
I agree entirely with that in terms of the capital markets. But as well, those deals that were done at the beginning of the year, there wasn't real massive market confidence in the fact that they were all transacted really quickly, right? Like, so people were not at a point of confidence where, not that you want to drag things out necessarily, but they were like, right, okay, if we're going to do this, we're doing it now because we don't know what the market's going to look like. We don't know what the spreads are going to be like in 2 months. And then lo and behold, we've had, a few sort of curveballs come in and the market's sort of, fluctuating again, right? So, yeah, I agree on that aspect. With the supply issue, I think we see how that one plays out. We still have, despite the fact that there has been a drop off in the US in terms of traffic and stuff like that, there's still a lack of manufactured aircraft, right? Still,
absolutely,
and getting aircraft into maintenance slots is a nightmare. So there's still a demand there, I think. But in the US, you're seeing a little bit of that kind of fall away in terms of traffic numbers, and whether that will then move to Europe, I think will probably be the next market hit, because that's usually the way it goes, right?
What about the supply of capital? Have you seen any changes in that, or the appetite of capital?
Other than sort of most recently in terms of the public markets in the US, not really, to be honest. We have seen a couple of deals put on hold, a couple of credit committees that have said no in the last few weeks on things that they were doing, but they were definitely deals that were either about to go immediately to the capital markets or being put together with that as the exit point, right? But in terms of sort of availability of funds, not really. The banks are still pretty much sort of fighting the same banks, right? That we would see, the more traditional players in the market are still there. And as I say, we've just set up in the last 2 or 3 months, Walkers, not just myself on the Irish side, but my colleagues in Cayman as well. Between us, we've set up 3 new platforms,
right? So there's definite interest and new money coming in all the time. And also what we're seeing as well is like traditionally it would have been very much sort of leasing platforms, but now we're moving more and more to having these kind of alternative lending platforms. So that's another avenue that's a stream of lending that's come about in the last 5 years or so, where most of them are very, very new, and we again are having discussions about 2 more of those at the moment, right? I think that suddenly they've seen there is the exit there as well, and I think that's very important when you're coming to this from a fund back. If you're a financial institution where you've got retail banking and stuff, you've got all this money coming in, then you don't need to recycle the same cash. But for guys that are coming in with investor money, they need to be able to recycle their cash, and they've seen that with the sort of CLO ABS hybrid paper being issued. So they've seen, right, okay, we can do this, right? Again, I have my own reservations because I do think that CLOs, aircraft CLOs or ABS hybrids, whatever you want to call them, getting that diversity in that portfolio is the struggle, and getting to the volume you need to be able to sort of do it. I mean, look at PK Apollo, they've got a huge portfolio, so they're able to just slice and dice it and tranche it as they want to, right? But that doesn't really play out for people that are building up their book gradually, right? And they're having to borrow against their own book, so they're kind of the lender, but they're also borrowing, so they're kind of sitting between a rock and hard place sometimes. But that's definitely new money and different money that's coming in, and that is a new source of funding. So I don't think capital is an issue in aviation. I mean, we used to have presentations. I mean, you said to me at the start, you sort of recognised me from the conference circuit, and I've been doing conferences in this space for many, many years. Oh, I've just lost you there. And the reality is that we always used to have those. Do you remember those boring presentations about the funding gap? Right.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah.
I remember that.
Right.
Yeah, like 2011.
That used to be one of the kind of stock standard dry presentations or panel discussions. How many years is it since we saw one of those?
It's been.
But I would argue we're exactly flipped. I think it's the exact opposite now. I think we have excess capital. I mean, we did for sure in 21, 22 when there was just excess capital, and we saw the pricing kind of take the hit as it were. But there certainly is no gap. It seems in excess right now. I mean, that being said, though, I mean you raise a good point, and it generates an idea. Picture this: the Time on Wing Fund. Right?
Time on Wing Fund.
Now, I've only been missing 2 pieces, right? So the idea is, right? Sale leasebacks. We 0.4 lease rate factor, right? We overpay for the airplanes. 0.4 on the lease rate factor. 12-year deals, 12-year leases. We retire at year 10. I needed an appraiser, and I needed somebody on the legal side who could set it up. We are good to go. Like, what could possibly
just need
go
the money?
Wrong?
Where's your money?
We're talking like 200% residual values, like at year 12.
Right. There's nothing wrong with
this.
That. I mean,
and we all retire before the fund comes to an end.
No, that's key.
That's key.
That's the key point.
Yeah. That's in the documentation. All initial members will retire at year 10.
But I remember a time not too long ago, and we're probably still in it depending on the firm, where, and it was kind of said to me privately, and I believe this: the worst case scenario for us is not losing deals or money losing deals or IRR. The worst case scenario is we don't deploy capital, and that needs to be deployed this year. That's what my bonus now is based on. That's what our future revenues are. And if you have that much money chasing those deals, you see that pricing erode.
Yeah.
I don't know that it collapses. By the way, I don't think we're looking at like The Big Short sequel or anything like that, but how it unwinds and re-rationalizes.
One thing that is good in the sort of aircraft space. I mean, if you look at the recent incidents that we've had to deal with, right? COVID and the Russian Ukrainian sort of conflict, etc. Those and the manufacturing problems. Despite all of that, deals are still functioning and performing. Asset values are still holding up. So I think, there is a good news story to be told. And if you compare that to other sort of asset classes where, funds might invest in, the other positive is, 12 years might be long enough for us to retire before the fund ends. But compared to other funds, that's fairly short term. You're not tying your capital up for 25 years like you would in an infrastructure deal or something like that. So there are some real upsides to it. And I do get why they're in this space. Let's face it, if they weren't in space, I wouldn't have a job. So that's always quite a good one for me. But the reality is, financially, I can see why it stacks up. It's just where the numbers are perhaps so different to how a traditional model would go. And the other thing is the level of interest now in that kind of mid to end of life stuff, which, again, is not my area of expertise, but it's just like everyone seems to be there's the sale and lease back, nice, shiny new stuff, but there seems to be just as much sort of competition at the other end of the spectrum these days, and that's a new thing as well.
Yeah, because and that but it kind of makes sense, right? Because it's everybody goes into the sale leaseback space, so therefore returns start going down because it all comes down to, okay, who's willing to take either a lower lease rate factor or a kind of end of lease compensation versus maintenance, it kind of, there's a lot of that gets driven by that. Or you look at, well, the big guys will do the bigger deals, right? So they're doing 10 airplanes at a time versus onesie twosies. But then you look at, okay, so those returns are, maybe they're okay, but they're not great, right? Okay, so what do we do to look at next? And then people go, well, midlife space, yeah, it's it's a little riskier because you're dealing with used airplanes and we're going to have to remarket them, but that's where the opportunities are, right? And of course, with the shortage that we've seen, starting in 21, now all of a sudden it's kind of like, people can't get their hands on enough airplanes, enough engines, enough landing gear, all these different things. And so I think what we're seeing now in that space is what's differentiating, I think, the different parties is who has the better technical understanding to really make sense of those deals, so that, if you're doing a deal that's like 2-3 years or, 3 to 5 years, they're not 10-year deals, right?
Yeah.
So you have to understand that. So that to me is kind of the differentiator right now, is who can have that level of understanding, so that, on the back end, they know what they're getting back, they know where the value is, and they can price it accordingly, and they can take more risk because they understand that, versus others that are just kind of like piling in, and we'll just get a diversified pool, right? And that'll balance things out and we'll be okay. But I think in the end, like, those that have the expertise will probably do better because of that. But it's definitely, there's definitely that move. And then, I think the next level is going into parts, but I think that's the level of technical understanding there is different way problem. Too high for so many people, right? So those that do understand, right, they'll do great because they will understand. But then again, then you're hearing about people that are willing to pay really high prices for airframes, for run-out engines, and I'm like, how could you make money on that? How can you expect that? What you're paying for, you're going to make money on top of that.
That
I haven't figured out yet. But they are, right? Just because the demand is there for now. I don't know how long it's going to last. But yeah, so it is interesting how the industry kind of always looks to see, all right, how much further can we push on the risk profile to get the better returns? And then as soon as people start seeing that, they're like, well, we should get into that too. And it just, right? It's just kind of, until things go bad, and then people are like, oh my God, let's never do that again. It's going to be, bad forever. And then you have the guys that have been around for some time that have gone through a couple of different downturns that are like, oh, now is the opportunity.
Yeah, right.
Get ready. So,
but I think that what's quite interesting is that those sort of opportunities, they aren't that many though, because that is going back to my point that most of the deals are still performance. I mean, when we started to see a downturn in the market, COVID, there were lots of funds that set up their special sits type arrangements. And honestly, they were really struggling to sort of find assets to put in them. And that was a real problem with deploying capital for them, because they were paying commitment fees and stuff on like funds and whatever, or debt. And it was costing them. And they were really struggling to actually find deals that met the criteria to put in them. But, you know, there's always someone there, right? So someone, and when the market turns, some of the new entrants will run for the hills with their fingers burned, but there's always enough that stay around that there is that kind of growth in the amount, the available capital.
And I always ask the question more from an aviation side, but it works from a financial side as well. Or what? Like, let's say that the returns in aircraft turn south and it's not great. I don't think that's the threat. I think the threat is that there's a better investment elsewhere. Whether it be, I mean, look, we saw it with interest rates, right? So suddenly you have treasuries, topping 4%. And so the big money supply now has alternatives to the yields that had turned south for aviation, simply because it was commoditized and that was the only place to find. And we saw the ABS market dry up for what, 18 months, Garrick? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, you had a couple that happened because they had to, but beyond that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Donna, do you have any experience, or have you done any funding work on like engine specific?
I did an ABS for an engine ABS for ST engineering. So that was, I think it was was it Sunbird or something like that? I should remember the name really. So
they're all made up. I think you open a book and point your finger at the
number
dictionary.
Number 1, number 2, number 3 of whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't, I mean, from my perspective, and this is probably sort of bad to say, the sort of, specifics of the asset really aren't a part of contracts that I have a huge amount of dealing with. There's sort of schedules at the back which are about delivery condition and, what they need to do in terms of maintaining them specifically and stuff. Whereas the bit of the document that I tend to deal with is very much sort of high level. And I always say with sort of documentation, the important bit of it is that if things go horribly wrong, it gives you something to hang your hat on and to open negotiations. It's really, I mean, in 9 times out of 10, you are not going to go in all guns blazing and sort of, try and grab your aircraft back or whatever, unless things have really, there is no hope, right? It's a tool for negotiation. So, whether it's an aircraft, an engine, or part financing, which I've done as well, it really is about making sure you've got the right sort of covenants in there to be able to protect yourself. And they, in their nature, are essentially the same. The specific detail behind them is a much more technical than my knowledge, and that I kind of leave to the experts. So, a contract sort of, we put the pen to the paper, but it takes an awful lot of people. Whenever you're doing a lease, there's sort of insurance specialists, there's technical experts, there's sort of jurisdictional experts, there's, modelers, credit people, whatever, and they all feed into it. The lawyer might be the person that's sort of bringing it all together, but
all I heard was billable hours. Then there's billable hours. Oh
yeah, billable hours is always all about. Yeah, that is my life. Billable hours. I have to say, I'm probably. I've been a lawyer now for 25, 26 years. I don't know. I can't remember. And I still hate timesheets. I've hated filling in timesheets my entire career, and it's still the biggest chore. And I now have to tell my sort of team off for not being up to date on their billable time and stuff like that. Whereas I know that my stats are just generally terrible because I'm really poor at kind of downloading it. And the more like you become into management, the more you do sort of admin type stuff. And then I'm a bit like, well, why do I have to be so specific about this? I know I do, but like if it's client chargeable, I get it, right? You need to be very specific so you're not overcharging and stuff like that. I get it. But when it comes to like internal stuff, I'm like, really, do I need to sort of be putting every minute of every day down? But the answer is Yes, I do, I'm afraid, but there you go. The joys of being a lawyer.
That's the right answer, yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
The answer is yes. So there we go. I mean, I'm not, in that respect, it's like I'm not a lawyer that likes sort of like that kind of in the weeds type. I mean, I really like commercial, like negotiation. That's kind of why, that's why I love the industry, because I do feel that it's a real people industry, and it's about meeting people and the characters and stuff like that. And, if I had my time again, would I be a lawyer? I don't know. Would I be in aviation? Yeah, I probably would.
Ooh.
And
is there another? I'm interested. Where's the other direction you may have considered?
I really probably would have liked to go into the more commercial stuff, but
Sure.
I think we're sort of going off on a bit of a tangent here, and just pull me back if I'm going the wrong way. But
that's what the T in Time on Wing originally said.
Right, okay, well, here we go then. No, I think the reality is it is, as an industry, fairly it's niche, right? And it's hard to get into, and that commercial sort of side of things. There's a lot of sort of father to son, and I would say mother to daughter, but that really doesn't exist because that's another issue in our industry. But that kind of nepotism and who you know and getting in that way. And I do think it's opening up a bit more. But certainly when I started out my career, it wasn't an industry of which I really had any awareness whatsoever. And I trained to be a lawyer, and then you sort of fall into that trap, and that's where you are. And I probably, there are certainly lawyers that have made the transition into the commercial space. And I actually think they're very well suited to it because they understand the risk analysis, but I think I probably just sort of that opportunity just didn't come up for me. But certainly I think it will be something that I probably would do if I had my time again.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of crossover.
Career.
I mean, you see a lot of, like you said, a lot of people, even today, are in commercial. I think of like Herb Kelleher and Richard Anderson. I mean, just talking airline CEOs here, but it's certainly a transferable skill.
Yeah.
More than what Garrick and I have, I can tell you that.
So talk about niche. Maybe it's like back at you. Like, if you had your time again, would you be in aviation and if you were doing what you're doing?
There's no way I couldn't. I don't mean like, I love it so much, which I do. There's no path that I wouldn't have gotten sidetracked into aviation. Like, it's inevitable for me.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I guess would I be in aviation? I mean, I went to school for aviation, right? So that kind of put me on that path. I really didn't. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I would have done something in aviation, right? Whether it was, I was looking at like working for like an OEM or working for. And it just kind of worked out where, I kind of started doing leasing, and that's how I got to do evaluations for the lessors. But it would have been, whether it was like corporate aviation or commercial, it would have been one of those. Yeah, because it is, I mean, as you say, it's a niche industry where like everybody knows everybody else. And like every time I look at these like conference, the attendees, I'm like, oh, so I'm just going to see the same people again that I just saw like 2 months ago. I'm like, oh, well, that'll be, it gives you, it's like that comfort level. You're like, oh, it's kind of nice,
it is.
Right? I'm not going to go and there's like nobody that I know. I'm like, oh, okay.
But that's not why we joined aviation. That's why we stay.
That's why we stay. Exactly. Right. That is why you stay. But it's the great part, I think, about aviation that I love is the global factor, right? I mean, because there's not that many industries that I think that have that vast of a kind of a diversified culture, right? I mean, when you think about it, like you can, like how many people get to travel to where the places that we go to, get to deal with different cultures. It's just like different people, that to me, that's the great part, right? Because you just kind of always get bombarded by different things that are going on, and then it's obviously up to you to kind of figure out, okay, well, yeah, I wanted to learn more about, how they do business here or how they do business there. And but yeah, I think that's the part that kind of keeps you here, right? Because it's just kind of like there's never a dull moment. It's not like we're sitting here going, oh man, this is so boring. I don't want to do this tomorrow because it's just the same thing over and over again. Like there's always something new that pops up.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And you think you've sort of done it all, and then something else crops up. I mean, just last week I was approached by someone about doing a deal in Uzbekistan, and little did I know, amongst the number of double taxation treaties that Ireland has, which there are like 70 odd, there's one with Uzbekistan. So there you go. And and I've never done a deal there before, so that will be interesting. My instant thought was, oh my gosh, this is going to be a nightmare for compliance, right? But beyond that, I think it would be really interesting, right? And that's the reality. I mean, I don't know anything about the Uzbeks really in terms of how they do business, how they go about things, what their sort of, cultural tendencies are and stuff like that. And it's, all of that's really intriguing and interesting, aside of the structuring of the deal and stuff. All of that stuff around it I love, and that's what I love about our industry, and it's the opportunity to meet these people and get to know them, and they become part of your circle. I often say to people post-COVID, I didn't realise how many friends I had in aviation. I used to sort of distinguish between friends and colleagues, and then I realised actually how much I missed my so-called colleagues from the aviation industry during COVID. And I realised that actually they are genuinely my friends. They're different friends. They're not the kind of friends that I necessarily invite around my backyard for a barbecue on a weekend. But right. I love going and hanging, like you say. You go to a conference, wherever, you're off to Tokyo next week, whatever, and you'll go there and there'll be familiar faces, and you'll have you genuinely enjoy their time and the experience of spending time with them, and they're friends, right? And it's a really friendly industry full of fascinating characters.
Yes, yeah. Characters is definitely the right word for a lot of the folks in our industry, or on right here anyway, on this podcast as well. Yeah, which actually that leads me to a question in terms of, so from your side, right, dealing with, I guess, how do you deal with the different cultures when it comes to, because I would think obviously all the contracts and everything else, language, it's based on English, right? But there has to be some nuances that are potentially built in based on the different cultures, so that there is less misunderstanding, because I'm sure that's probably an issue where somebody looks at kind of a language and a contract, and they understand it one way based on their understanding of the language versus somebody else, right? So how do you deal with that when you're looking at like the different jurisdictions that you work with?
I mean, I think the important thing is, like, although I do like the sound of my own voice, and I'm notorious for talking a lot, is to do a lot more listening.
We made a podcast, literally, to accomplish the same thing.
I need my own one. I don't need you guys on this line at all. But like, the reality is, I think, toning that down and becoming the listener and trying to understand where they're coming from, because usually, because of the nature of my client base, I'm in charge of the document, right? So I've already had my opportunity to put forward where I'm coming from, because they've got a draft of the document in front of them. So I need to sort of listen and understand what their concerns are. And sometimes they're cultural, but sometimes it's just they're a product of experience, as everybody is. They've had their fingers burnt on one very specific thing, and they want to accommodate that in the lease, for example, right? And just understanding where they're coming from, why they feel they need that, and what risk or perceived risk they're trying to cover off. Most of the time, you can actually find a way forward. Like, we're not in an adversarial area of the law here, and we shouldn't be. And anyone that walks into a room thinking it's a fight, they've really got it completely the wrong way around. We are people who are going in a room with the intention of coming out with an agreement, because there are terms there that, on the face of it, we can make work. And if the lawyers can't document that, they're very poor at their jobs, if you ask me, right? This isn't, getting on and being commercial and being pragmatic and listening to one another. And it sounds cliche and maybe a little bit cheesy, but that's the reality. We are in an area of commercial discussion and negotiation, and we want everyone in that room wants to get the deal done, right? So just listening to one another. I mean, I've had some real left field ones.
one of the Arabian airlines was very focused on, the IATA rules about the carriage of animals and stuff like that, about their eagles and their, flying eagles, which are worth an absolute fortune and are like pets to them. They, the thought of putting them in the hold is abhorrent, right? So you kind of have to just deal with that and understand that's important to them, right? Equally, I've had somebody say to me, indemnities, do we need them? Well, then you have to have a little bit more discussion around it. But, you explain to them why you do need them. And essentially it's like, well, you've just been given a $50 million asset. What we have is a piece of paper to sort of save ourselves. So we need them in there to know how you're going to stick to your side of the bargain. But it is about just sort of listening to people and trying to work out why they are concerned about what they are raising. I'm not a lawyer. Lawyers I can't tolerate, and this is probably, sort of too much information, but can't bear people that go through a document putting reasonable in all the time, right?
What's that mean, by the way?
Yeah, exactly. and also, if you don't work on the basis that you are going to be reasonable, why are you sitting there having this conversation, right? It doesn't add anything as a legal construct at all, right? Unless you're going to go down and start defining what reasonable means, which is just ridiculous. And then other people
then what's ridiculous mean? We better define that.
Right.
Well, that's it. So, I mean, it's sort of like, I think we have to all be sort of sensible and pragmatic and don't do things to wind people up, really. So anyone that's listening to this, don't put reasonable in your contract because you will wind me up. But, I mean,
Or do it to wind her up.
Yeah, do it to wind me up. And see if I'm still pragmatic. Test me. Test me.
There you go, So get what you want before and then put in reasonable afterwards.
Oh, yeah.
Just to get you going. There you go.
Don't try that.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in... So there are a few professions within aviation that are more... they span basically every industry, and you specialize in aviation. Legal absolutely is one of those. I don't know how much experience you have outside aviation in the legal profession, but how is aviation perceived within the legal? Is that a fair question? Am I asking it?
Yeah, no,
appropriately?
I know what you're saying.
Are we the Wild West, or?
I think some people think we're slightly the Wild West. I mean, one thing I didn't sort of, when I was going through my sort of background, I didn't mention is I am actually trained as a barrister, and I spent time at the bar, wig and gown and all sorts, and amongst certain sort of representations, I represented sort of an armed robber on one occasion, which was one of the funniest stories I ever told, but probably not appropriate for this podcast. But I mean. How much do we sort of specialise and know what we're going into? It's aviation is, I suppose, different in some ways to other legal sectors in the fact that we as lawyers perceive ourselves to be industry experts rather than from a specific legal framework. So I'm broadly speaking, I would describe myself as a structured finance lawyer, specialising in aviation. However, if there's an M&A transaction that involves one of my leasing clients, I'll be all over it, right? Now, I wouldn't do it without some corporate lawyers, and they would be sort of leading on the sort of sale and purchase agreement. But there's so much aviation-specific stuff that comes up that's industry-specific. They couldn't do it without us being largely involved with it. Whereas if you're a corporate lawyer, you're kind of agnostic towards the industry that you're dealing with. And so we are slightly different. The other thing is there aren't that many of us, right? So for most firms in London, they wouldn't have aviation finance as a discipline at all, right? It's sort of the reserve of, I suppose, the larger global firms because of the nature of what we do. So, despite the fact there are quite a few lawyers these days in the space, if you compare it to the number of lawyers in other areas, we're still a small group of people. So Are we a bit odd? Yeah, I certainly think so. I mean, at Clifford Chance, there was a 30-floor building and we were put on the 29th floor, and we always used to say that's because they shoved us up there so they could forget we existed. But, we approach things in a slightly different way. But in the end, like I trained as, I could within the legal construct, I could transfer and do sort of debt financing for anything, right? It just doesn't have the adjunct of being aviation related.
If there is a value, there is a value in specializing. So I'm looking at this from the legal profession. I'm trying to shift my perspective, look at it from the legal profession as they're choosing where to specialize. There's value in specializing in aviation. Is there more value in that specialization in this industry than, say, infrastructure? I don't know. I don't even know what other ones, what other options there are.
I think, it tends to be larger global firms that do it. And, let's be honest, that they're not the cheapest firms, right? So there is money to be had in it, else they wouldn't be in the space. That's a commercial reality. But in terms of the size of the team, I think there's definitely a perception that it's not a group that can grow indefinitely in a way which you could grow, I don't know, a sort of debt capital markets team, right, or a restructuring team or something like that, which can grow and grow and grow because they are so universal in what their touch points, right? So they tend to, asset finance teams tend to be fairly small, and even the largest teams in the city, in London, they'd only have like 5 partners, right, that specialise. And compared to other groups, that's they'd have 20, 30 partners in them. It's small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so a quick follow-on question to that. What makes you so good at your job? What's the secret sauce? And hold on, let me get a pen and paper so I can write this down.
Yeah.
But where do you see kind of that? Well, look, give us the marketing pitch. I mean, in a way, I'm not actually interested in marketing pitch, but I want to know.
Or do you want the Donna marketing pitch or the Walker's marketing pitch? I mean,
what makes a good specialized aviation lawyer?
I think you need to fully understand and appreciate the industry and what people are trying to get out of it. But I also think that you need to value relationships and be honest and consistent in your approach, because it is a small industry and you can't sit on one side of the table one week saying one thing and then jump to the other side and say the complete opposite the next week, because your credibility is shot, right? So knowing where you are in the space, knowing so within that expertise and specialism, I'm even more specialised in the fact that I don't represent airlines, I don't represent operators, right? So knowing your client base and understanding what it's all about and what they want to achieve. But for me, I suppose, everyone has their strong suit. I've been lucky to work in some really good firms. So, I'd say that drafting is kind of something that I really enjoy doing. Sadly, that's the bit the geeky side of me. But the bit that I think probably sets me out is that I don't consider myself to be one of those stereotypical bookish type lawyers. I'm kind of a people person, and my
I can confirm. so far, you passed
connecting with people is kind of where I'm at, right? And that's my personal sort of branding. The firm that I work for, Walker's now, we've obviously got fantastic offices, as you can see from my backdrop here. But where we set ourselves apart again is knowing which part of the market we function in, right? We hold ourselves out as a firm that represents financial institutions, be they sort of regulated, unregulated, so banks, funds, those kind of guys, investors, alternative lenders, and that we are all about structuring and ensuring efficiency and that's why we have the offices located in the jurisdictions that we do, because it's all about in those investment hubs and maximising value for our clients. So as a firm, we know our space, right? And I think that's really important. You can't be everything to everyone.
No, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to touch on something that you talked about before. You talked about obviously kind of working on a lot of new structures that are coming online. Even in the last 6 months or a year or so. I guess from your side, what is changing, if anything, with these structures to, because I'm sure as people move around and as people set up new structures, they hopefully use the understanding or the experience that they've had in the past to be able to do something, hopefully better, more successful, right? So have you seen any changes, over the course of the last, 5, 10, 15 years, as those structures get set up, like what are some of the bigger differences that you've seen that's coming into play now? So,
I mean, recent advent that we've seen, and I suppose I'll talk sort of more recently and go back, but it's sort of, at the end of January last year in 2024, the Irish revenue, and I've just to be clear, although I'm English, I now practice Irish law, so I'm very much sort of understanding about the leasing stuff out of Ireland. They handed down guidance about trading status, and so that has created a move from the kind of, which we've been seeing for some time, but the move from the single asset owning entities that you used to have traditionally to multiple asset owning. So, 5, 6 aircraft in an entity. And because that bolsters the sort of trading status of companies in Ireland. Okay. And so that's something that I think we've seen for a long time. And I remember I sort of talk about ABS in sort of we've had 3 or 4 sort of rounds of them, but in rounds 1 and 2, the rating agencies would insist on one entity holding one aircraft, right? So if you had 26 aircraft in your ABS, you'd have 26 asset owning entities. That's long gone. I mean, and in the asset finance space now, what we're seeing increasingly is a move towards, an ABS as well as sort of transfers, is transferring entities as well rather than metal. And that comes with sort of different issues associated with it. I mean, obviously you sort of inherit legacy liabilities from the companies and stuff there. So there's analysis to be done there. But if they're fairly passive entities that are recently set up, and I think, then you can handle that. And I think that change has come about because of the nature of the investment that's coming in. And as we talked about earlier, that short-term flip, they're setting up entities and 18 months, 24 months later, you're out in them. So they don't really have much history, and they don't, so you can be comfortable that they haven't been sort of like doing one set of debt, repaying it, borrowing from someone else, and having all potential liabilities, right? So that's a definite change. I also think there is, unfortunately, and this is might seem bizarre coming from a lawyer, there's a desperate desire to over document absolutely everything, right? And when I started out, I think it's partly because at the time we started with typewriters. That was my day. I'm not quite that old, but I wasn't far off of that. But we used to have leases that were 20 pages. Do you remember those days, right? And now, if you get a lease that's less than 120 pages, you're doing well.
So actually, that made me think of another question, which is, I think throughout the whole, pretty much the span of my career, I've always heard that basically novations are just a nightmare for lessors, because ultimately you're trying to get the attention of an operator to do an ovation if you're trying to do a deal, right? Has that evolved? Is that evolving so that it makes it easier, or what? Right? Because it feels like it's still a challenge that everybody has, which almost comes down to, how can you get somebody's attention, and ultimately how much are you willing to pay to get somebody to focus on it, right? But
I think we've seen, in that respect, we have seen a change there. We are seeing now quite a lot of lessees that have clout having a fee put in that they're paid, right? And some of the fees are astronomical, frankly. Ryanair and stuff, 250,000 just for transferring a lease. But the reality is, if it means that you pay 250 and they just sign on the dotted line, you send a confirmation that there's no increased obligations and that's it, then maybe the time, and also, let's be honest, the sort of, fees that you would pay out to their lawyers and other lawyers and other advisors. It justifies it. There's also obviously the advent of like trusts, more trusts. I have a certain level of skepticism around them personally, because I don't think anything really removes the lessee. You can't remove the lessee from the process. You can limit their exposure. But the reality is things like insurance certificates and stuff, which are absolutely vital, you need to go to the airline and get them to approach their broker. That's simple, right? So you can never remove them. So I think, the owner trusts, which was very much sort of pushed by the AWG and GATS and all of that kind of stuff, I think when trading was really up and it was really vibrant, they were used, but I've definitely seen a drop off in those as well. Novations are always problematic, frankly. They, choosing your time of year depending on the operator is a factor. I know that sounds ridiculous, but don't. No, it
makes sense, right?
Don't go to EasyJet in the middle of the summer because they haven't got the time. When we used to do those deals, which we used to have like an ABS and used to launch it and then transfer them in. There'd always be one or two that would take like 18 months. It's just mad. Yeah. It should never take that long. In terms of what is required, it should never take that long. But if you can't get someone to engage, you're on a bit of a hiding to hell, to be honest. It's a nightmare. I mean, and as a lawyer, there's only so much you can do about sort of sending documents out time and time again. It really does come down to the commercial guy traveling to whichever sort of weird and wonderful place they need to sit in their office until they look at it, right? And that's
I find this fascinating. Certainly it was never anything I expected, just the change and the variation in novations over the year, but it does raise a question that's been nagging at me. What's a novation? What are novations? Listen.
Sorry.
So like it's just a transfer. It's the document transfer. I mean, in the States, you probably. I mean, that's a very English law document. In the States, you'd have an assignment of assumption, and there's it's just because there's a matter of English law, you can't transfer obligations. So you have to have what they call a novation, which is getting into legal technicality, but effectively it's like it's a new contract but on the same terms, right? But I mean it's just the transfer document, so it can come in various different forms, and by having an owner trust type arrangement, you literally just have a transfer certificate, which is a one-pager, whereas if you don't have that, you have a much more full-blown document. But it really comes down to, like, does the new lessor meet the requirements, whether they've got the net worth or any other conditions, and most importantly, is the lessee going to be, subject to further obligations as a result of the transfer? Because if they are, there's only two ways to go there. They're either going to say no, we're not doing it, or the new lessor picks up the cost of that, and usually that's a tax implication, and that makes it a bit of a no-go, right?
So one of the things that is probably very apropos, right, is, I mean, when you look at kind of the tariff environment today, like, how do you guys advise your clients? Because I'm sure you get asked the questions. We get asked the questions about the implications of that. So from your standpoint, like, you guys need to probably have more knowledge on that in terms of what that's going to do. How do you guys stay on top of that with a moving picture, basically, right? It's a moving target.
Yeah. She needs to have actual knowledge. We can make things up. We have no bar standard. There's nothing.
It's our opinion at the end of the day. So,
I mean, to be honest, it is such a moving target. It's really difficult at the moment, and I think the tariff and the implications on sort of the cost of aircraft and stuff is yet to be identified. I mean, I think what you have to make clients aware of, if they haven't worked it out for themselves, which most of my clients are infinitely more intelligent than I am, but is that any tariff that's applied is in multiple in the reality, right? So because every time you've got something coming in to the States that's from outside, every time it gets moved around, it's in, out. So on the face of it, 15% tariff might end up like being applied 3 or 4 times. And also identifying where parts come from is, it's an impossible job. When I worked at Airbus, we used to have to identify what we described as dual use parts. So parts that were like effectively could be used on commercial as well as military aircraft, because if we ever put aircraft into areas which were potentially they were subject to sanctions, but only for military aircraft, but if they had, if a commercial aircraft had stuff on it that was, could be used for military purposes, that counted. And just identifying those parts was an absolute nightmare. And they were a few parts on an aircraft. If you're having to break the whole thing down, I just think it's impossible. I mean, what the reality is, more than 50% of aircraft that are in commercial operation have a touch point in Ireland, right? So for our clients, they've got aircraft coming from all over the place. And I think it will make certain jurisdictions really hard to deal with. But everyone's just holding their breath that actually, that doesn't happen, and that there will be some discussions. The UK are sort of breaking through and getting their way a little bit. But I mean, the big issue, for Ireland, to be honest, is the dynamic between the EU and the US. And I don't want to get into politics, but it's sort of like, they will go up against one another if they have to. Right, and that's not good for anybody. In my view, it's certainly not good for Boeing, right? And Boeing are experienced certain issues already, and I think that they will find that it will actually detrimentally affect Boeing far more than Airbus, if I'm being honest.
So, just as a bit of news, which is completely pointless because this podcast won't find the light of day for at least another week until I can edit it.
But it'll be irrelevant by then.
It'll have changed 3 times. Yeah.
So listeners can fast forward through this part. But we're recording May 8th, and this is the day that they announced the trade deal with the UK. And I spent the time when Garrick was talking actually reading the. More details are coming out. Now, what I think is so important about what just happened in the overall context of how the uncertainty and all this, one, the market has popped because this is what markets do. They get excited over news. So that's interesting in its own right. But the 10% tariff stays as a part of this deal, according to, the President of the United States as of, 11:30 Central Time on May 8th, right? So whatever. But that to me seems... So this is a big political win, or it's messaged as such, and fine. In that political win that the market likes, apparently, is no change to tariffs. That seems important in how we look forward.
I mean, the balance of trade between the UK and the US is pretty even, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the kind of areas that the current US administration are targeting.
We send you bourbon, you send us scotch.
But mainly what we send you, honestly, if you look behind me, that's what it's all about. It's
pickles.
It's fun. Yeah, exactly. Gherkins. That's what it's all about. Yeah. Where would you be? Without the English gherkin? I don't even know if we picked it. But like
we'd definitely be in a pickle. That's for
sure. But yeah, I mean, it's financial services, it's service driven, right?
Yeah.
And I think for the UK, protecting that is very important. It's the driving force of our economy. And there's always discussion amongst British politicians in the same way as there is in the US about this sort of hankering for yesteryear and the manufacturing base and stuff. But the truth is, it's hard to go back and rebuild that if you've gotten rid of most of it, which we have in the UK. So protecting what we have and what we're good at is important. I'll be honest with you. I've since been on this, I haven't been catching up, but like the other thing that was a big issue for the UK was the 25% tariff on cars, automobiles, and
that's right.
If that's gone, that's huge, right?
Yeah,
because that was big. Like, for example, Jaguar Land Rover stopped transporting to the US on Liberation Day, as we fondly refer to it. Yeah, so that if that's gone, that's huge, right? But I also think it represents a bigger thing for the rest of the sort of, the world that is willing to sort of discuss this, is that there are deals to be done, and I think that's the message, and that's the bounce in the market, right?
But
the fact that there is
that's fair. I guess what strikes me as inflection pointy, is that the term? It is now. I coined it. It feels like an inflection point today that the deals that were promised, as the whole reason why I call it Libation Day, but Liberation Day is what they called it. The deal that was promised that justifies the tariff continues to include the tariff. Like, I think by the way, the UK-US deal was expected to be one of the very first.
Yeah.
Right. So there's, for all the reasons that you talked about. But if we're looking forward on how a lot of the mechanisms that you were talking about and understanding the mechanisms on the tariffs, and we're looking forward to how that may play out, I think what's fascinating is what is being billed as kind of mission accomplished. Hey, we did a thing. This is why we did it. Still includes the tariff. What does that mean for our industry looking forward, who I think a lot of what is being expected, for instance, let me give you a good example, not an aviation related example. Goods into the US from China down 60, or down 35%, I think, kind of generally. That means that 65% of the goods are still coming. We're talking 145% on these tariffs, right? There is the option that it certainly appears to be being exercised that those goods are not actually imported when they arrive. They go into a warehouse in bond, and the tariff is not paid until they get access to those. So a lot of business is still transacting based on the expectation, hope, whatever it is, that the future tariffs will be either not there or gone. I use that as the extreme example. In aviation, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the expectation was that the tariffs would be there, but this is one of the friendliest agreements, and it includes tariffs staying there. Did we just get a look into the long-term vision of aviation, which now includes tariffs, even though I thought they wouldn't?
Whilst I'm sort of, loath to in any way support sort of the tariffs, when they were calculated, they were looking, I think the tariffs were based upon, looking at importation costs into other countries. And to be fair, there are costs that, US goods are exposed to coming into the UK, and therefore that and they haven't been dropped down. So I suppose that it seemed to be that is in the round sort of an equal approach to it. There were also other concerns which were non-financial that the government of the UK were focused on when they went into the discussions. In particular, certain levels of regulation and control around food items and stuff.
And they did mention food. You're right. So I'm not concerned about the deal itself, right? Because
but also
two countries,
just the implications of it, and
for aviation. Specifically.
And I think the long and the short is on the financial side. I think if there are taxes applied at the point of entry for US goods, then you are going to see a similar level of taxes applied the other way round. And if the nicer you are, the more evenly killed that will be, and the better the relationship with the current administration, the better that will be for you as a country. But the more you kick up and the more you're China, frankly, the higher they'll be and the less they will be relevant to what you're charging. But tariffs are, they're effectively a tax, right? And there is lots of different ways of describing them and lots of things that are factored into those calculations. So I think, I'm loath to support the tariffs, but I think that it's inflammatory language. If you actually break it down and look at it, there is some methodology to it. It's just some. I think there's also a populist approach that's been adopted in the way that they've been brought in, rather than looking at what type, the nature of taxes that are available, already in existence, and that perhaps would or could be applied to certain goods.
And if I'm proposing the idea here that this is negative for aviation, in that I assumed the tariff would be negotiated away, it hasn't been, and this is the culmination of the deal. So my expectation was that, or my gut is that today's news is negative for aviation. I think it's only fair to point out that nobody agrees with me. Boeing's up 4.5%. So,
well, I would say that any tariffs on the nature of the goods that you prepare in aviation cannot be a positive, right?
Right.
Because
yeah.
It is, because the US public would think that Boeing is a US product, but it's actually manufactured all around the world and put together, right?
Yeah.
Obviously some of it is clearly manufactured within the US, but there are parts of it manufactured in many other countries. And so it's naive to think that just because it comes off a production line in Seattle that it's all been put together there. I think it is, it is negative for aviation. Facts, right?
Don't let me talk you into a conclusion, different conclusion.
I agree with you in that in the aviation sense, but I think in the kind of wider trade sense, there is an explanation for it. Whether it's a justification or not, I don't know. But I also go back to what I said earlier. I think that any tariffs, for want of a better term, are much more negative on Boeing than they are on Airbus, because wherever Boeing exports to or whatever, they're going to have some reciprocity, I would say. Whereas, if you're looking at an Airbus product, they're not going to have that except with the US.
Well, that's an interesting point, right? And it's because Boeing is exposed to 100% of their imports in billable materials just to build the airplanes. Whereas not all of Airbus's airplanes will be subject to a U.S. tariff because they now have the rest of the world to play in tariff.
Exactly.
Free. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think what we're very dangerously agreeing is that the market got it wrong. Maybe we should be traders.
Look, market.
What does the market know?
Markets react to announcements rather than to
I think you're right.
Physical change, right? And even if I'll be honest with you, I had this conversation earlier this week. I think even if Trump came out tomorrow and said no tariffs, not anywhere, the market wouldn't return to where it was before Liberation Day, because the concern that he might come back next week and say the opposite still remains, and so that instability and lack of security around what's going on will remain in the market, and as a result, there'll still be the fluctuations, right? So markets aren't about I don't want to sort of talk to you as if you don't, but they are about reaction to announcents rather than reality, right?
Yeah. That's where that edge comes in. Before we get too far, I do want to make sure we talk about one of my very favorite topics: women. But particularly
starting off on that basis, that's a really good way to talk about it.
No, but and so obviously in aviation and aviation's been doing a lot better, still certainly not there in getting more women in. I mean, we see a lot more women at ISTAT. It's way different than this today. What I'm really, obviously, I'm interested in your perspective as a professional woman in aviation, but I'm also very interested in it from the perspective of the legal profession.
Yeah.
First of all, does the legal profession have the same challenges that aviation has? Just getting women into the leadership positions.
In short, yes. If you look at the amount of graduates, law graduates that come into the profession, there are more females than men, right? But
yeah,
you look at the top of the profession, and there are infinitely more men than there are women. So that in itself speaks volumes, right? And I think that is all the more the case when you come into the areas of law like where I function. Transactional lawyers that have to work like perhaps antisocial hours. There's far more women in areas where it's sort of 9 to 5 than the kind of work that I do. So you break it down further like that. And I've sort of changed my attitude. I used to be sort of, when I was younger, very positive. It'll all change. It'll all come about. It's just a matter of time.
They'll beat that out of you.
Yeah, like life has beaten that out of me, Courtney. I tell you now. The reality is, you come into a status quo which has been basically created by men, right? That's the reality. Business, historically, there were no women in it, and there are some in it now, but we're still a minority. And so the kind of accepted practices and the accepted approach are those of a man. And so women are inevitably seen as a bit difficult because they don't necessarily fit that mold in the same way. And I definitely feel like that. I feel that, if I'm someone that will sort of, speak up about stuff, and I'm seen as challenging and confrontational as a result of it, whereas a guy's just seen as sort of, putting his view out there. It's very hard to walk that tightrope as a woman. But now I've got to a sort of stage in my career, both in terms of, I suppose, my seniority, but in terms of the fact I'm that long in the tooth, I don't care anymore, where I actually just say, no, this isn't right. Just because you like to do it like that, that doesn't mean it's right. And actually, being challenged is positive for the business, and, having different views and, and it's not about men and women, it's about just different views completely, whoever they're coming from. Is a positive, right? Having that more collective approach. And in aviation, we have seen, growth in the number of women that are there. But how much growth have we seen in areas like the commercial group sector? Mm-hmm. Very little. We are seeing women who've come up through, I think, the more established professions, so be it lawyers or accountants and stuff like that. But when it comes to like the sort of the deal doers, the people that ultimately go on to become the CEOs, it's not usually women, right? And
why
that's
do you
where
think
it is.
Where does that fall apart? I'm thinking in the mechanics. So is it because the women who go and look for funding just aren't getting it? Is it because are they stopped earlier than that? Is it are they never promoted out of the kind of the lower level younger positions to get to that opportunity?
I think that, if I knew the answer to that, first of all, I would be worth an absolute fortune. But I think the reality is it sort of is about the fact. Well, there's firstly, let's be honest, there is a natural situation where only women can have children, and that does create a different approach, right? Yep. So even if you come back to your profession, you have to take time out. However short or long you choose that period to be, that's inevitable. So that's a hiatus in your development, even if you come back. And you find quite often when you come back that someone else might have slotted in, or you might be seen, on a different tangent. Interestingly, on that one, sorry, just as sort of an aside, friend of mine is about to go on her second maternity leave, and on the first one, her and her husband shared the paternity, which you can do sort of with more sort of progressive companies. And he said second time round, he wasn't going to do it this time because he felt that it held his career up. Fact. And so he's not doing it, which I thought was quite interesting. Quite telling.
I'll bet he's not wrong. I'm sure that it did. But now consider,
So that's one factor. But we're never that's a reality that's never going to change. Well, certainly not in our lifetimes or the next, and our children's either. But the other thing that can change is the openness to allowing the world to be looked at differently, and that goes back to my point about the status quo. Right, and not always thinking that the way it's done now is the best way. However successful your business is, it doesn't mean it can't be more successful. And I don't look at this through a sort of like, oh, we need women there. I look at it because I think you need women there because they are going to be good for business. They will make your business more successful if you have that cross-section of society represented at all levels of the company. It's not about feeling sorry and a sop to people and ticking boxes, right? I mean, I think the ability to allow people to be authentic and grow in the company is absolutely key. If the only way that women or any minority group, underrepresented group, grow is by them sort of morphing into the CEO, you're not achieving anything. You're not achieving any diversity, and it's certainly not an inclusive environment.
But look, I know we've kept you on long enough, but it's been really enjoyable to kind of get to know you a little bit more, get to know about your background. So thanks for taking time to join us, and to hopefully I'm sure a lot of people will get a lot out of it as well. So thank you for doing that. It's been great chatting with you.
No, thanks, guys. I really appreciate the time, and nice to sort of get to know you guys better, and safe travels to Tokyo.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Courtney. Don't sound too disappointed that I'm still here.
Oh. Wow, Bitcoin's over 100 grand. I don't know when that happened.
Nice.
Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, a podcast. Oh, look at that.
Yeah.